Welcome, everyone. I'm James Shore, and this is the Art of Agile Development Book Club. Today, we're talking about blind spot discovery, how teams can learn what they don't know that they need to know. I'm very happy to have Janet Gregory and Abby Bangser joining us for today's session. Janet Gregory is co-author with Lisa Crispin on 3 books on Agile testing. She consults with Agile teams to help them integrate testing activities into their daily work. She's also co-founder of the Agile Testing Fellowship, offering holistic and Agile testing courses around the world. Janet, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you here. We also have Abby Bangser joining us today. Abby is a principal engineer with a passion for bringing product and software engineering practices to internal infrastructure and tooling. Currently, Abby is working with Syntasso to enable platform teams to build secure, scalable, and usable platforms. Outside of work, Abby co-hosts CoffeeOp's London Meetup, is an SLOConf global captain, and hobbles around a tag rugby field as much as she can. Abby, welcome.
Yes, hobbling more than usual right now, but thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be here.
I have to ask you, I've not heard of SLOConf. What is that?
It's based on service level objectives. So it's the idea of being able to track the service you're providing your users internally in a way that you can catch problems before they might hit SLAs or agreements you might have where you'd have to pay back if you don't meet those expectations. So.
Fantastic. That sounds like a topic that is very, very relevant in today's world. I am going to get things started by reading an excerpt from The Art of Agile Development. As a reminder, the book is out. This is the second edition. It's out in both ebook and print editions. It is basically a ground-up rewrite of the first edition. I think it's really good, but I'm a little bit biased. You can get it from Amazon by visiting jamesshore.com/s/buy AOAD2. And you can find excerpts and bonus material by visiting jamesshore.com/s/AOAD2. Blind spot discovery. We discover the gaps in our thinking. Fluent delivering teams are very good at building quality into their code, as you saw in the previous practice, which was no bugs, and we discussed in last week's book club. But nobody's perfect, and teams have blind spots. Blind spot discovery is a way of finding those gaps. To find blind spots, look at the assumptions your team makes and consider the pressures and constraints team members are under. Imagine what risks the team might be facing and what team members might falsely believe to be true. Make a hypothesis about the blind spots that could occur as a result and investigate to see if your guess is right. Testers tend to be particularly good at this. When you find a blind spot, don't just fix the problem you found, fix the gap. Think about how your approach to development allowed the bug to occur, then change your approach to prevent that category of bugs from happening again, as described in Prevent Systemic Errors, which was in the no bugs practice. So that's an introduction to the idea of blind spot discovery. I think it's a really important idea that a lot of organizations don't even think about, which is sort of a blind spot of their own. Let's go ahead and get started with our first topic. So, Janet, I think I'll direct this one at you just to get us going. Blind spot discovery is ultimately about finding the important gaps in what your team understands to be true. What are some of your favorite techniques for finding blind spots?
Yeah. There's those blind spots are those gaps you were talking about before. And so there's a few techniques that I like to do in the understanding part of it. So I think that one of my favorite ones is asking questions. And you talked about testers being very good at that sort of thing. So questions like, what problem are you trying to solve? Because a lot of teams forget that very basic question. Versus that, what do you want? Things like example mapping. I find that example mapping, when you're trying to understand a feature or a story, brings out a lot of hidden assumptions that people don't even think about. So example mapping, and I'll give you the link later, is from Matt Wynn, and it's just looking at concrete examples because it makes such a big difference. Another one that I like to do is thinking about what don't you want to appear in the headlines tomorrow? Mm-hmm. That's talking about risk. So things like risk storming, because we forget those sorts of things as well. So that's like a few of my favorite things.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic, especially because I do see that a lot of teams, they see themselves sort of as order takers, right? I'm going to build what I'm told to build. And they don't really think about, well, what does that mean for the business? And it's interesting. I don't know if you have seen the same thing, but it seems like that sort of attitude is more prevalent in the last 10 years than it was necessarily 20 years ago.
Well, I'm not sure it's more prevalent. I see it more often now because the organizations I'm dealing with now aren't the small teams anymore. They're the bigger organizations. And the more structure there is, the less questioning, I think, that goes on. And so learning to ask those what if questions is really important.
Yeah. Maybe I'm just seeing it more in the more in the Agile community, because when Agile first started, it was all about how do we create a great business result. And now it's been co-opted a bit, and it's more, how do we micromanage our teams, which is not really in the spirit of Agile.
No, it isn't. And we do see that. They come, this is what I want, and this is how I want you to do it. And we have to kind of get out of that to get those gaps highlighted, I guess.
Yeah. I think one of the things I've noticed with a move from more of an analyst role to a more engineering role is sometimes I find myself falling into that trap as well, even though I know the trap and I know it well and I don't want to be there. And I find that it's there when I find the engineering problem challenging. So I think it sort of also can depend on who on your team feels comfortable with the technologies that you're using. So the more that you're in this kind of whole stack, full stack engineering where there's a million different technologies you're touching and you're not deeply familiar with all of them, the more you can be, as an engineer, you can start kind of diving down do I even know how to solve this before you even know, should you be solving it or what is it that you're trying to solve? I find myself falling into that more frequently than I would like.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the engineering side, I mean, there's more blind spots than just in the field, just in the area of, are we building the right thing? And I know you've got an operations focus. What sort of techniques do you like to use to discover blind spots in your teams?
Yeah, I use actually a lot of the same things Janet was just talking about, right? Asking questions, being explicit with examples and things like that. I think I'd add another example question there around what would happen if you were to add either constraints or completely blow open the idea of things. So what would happen if we were to double or triple the size of our engineering team in the next 6 months? Or what would happen if we were to double the number of users we have? Like, how would that affect, the solutions we're talking about? We don't want to be engineering for 10 or 100x of where we are today, but we need to be aware of where we're building constraints in, because hopefully we'll get there. I think so. That's from like the question kind of asking and the before building kind of side of things. But there's of course places within while you're building and after you build as well. And I think one of the areas that I've become particularly enamored with is the after building, making sure that's something we're talking about and preparing for the whole time. And so how do we build in feedback loops from production? How do we build in telemetry or data to come out of our users' experiences on the production website or production application, so that we can learn from them and be able to feed that back in. So it's maybe not completely blind spot identification, because you do have to sometimes prepare what data is going to come back out, but just thinking about what areas are you interested in will tend to identify interesting areas.
Yeah, well, I think that qualifies as blind spot discovery, because blind spot discovery is really about, we think this is true, but we don't really know it's true, and let's find out. And then if it's not, then we have a gap.
I like to say that I went into operations from testing because I was sick of trying to fight for if a bug should be fixed, because I didn't know any better than the person fighting against me. So what I wanted to have happen was that we all agreed that we understood the complexity and we understood the impact and we thought it should be fixed or not. And so that whole idea of being able to add feedback loops for, you say this is never going to happen. Great. How about we put an alert or a log or something in there so that if it happens, we're aware of it, and then we can start making decisions on if we fix it. And that's really what got me into this telemetry and observability side of things.
And did it work? Did it help short circuit those arguments?
it does help. It's still a lot of hard work to get the right telemetry in there. And it's not, just like a test automation isn't a silver bullet, observability can't be either, but it gives us a technique that we didn't have before. And so that has helped tremendously.
Yeah.
And I think even just asking the questions to begin with is, how are we going to know? Right? It's that hypothesis thing. You also mentioned, Abby, about constraints. I paint on the side. So I do some art courses and things. And one of the course that I just listened to a little while ago was about creating constraints, because your creativity actually comes alive when you think about constraints and operate within a thing. So I found that interesting that you mentioned that.
Yeah, absolutely. How can we do this in half the amount of time? How can we get similar amount of success or outcomes from that? Yeah. And those kinds of questions can make a lot of difference as well, and can save our planet, save us money, possibly by doing less compute and everything else.
Yeah.
So,
if for all of you listening, love to hear your experiences with blind spots that you've encountered in your organizations, in your teams, in your code bases. Hear your thoughts about how you might discover those, or what you use to prevent blind spots. Just raise your hand in Zoom. Would love to hear from you. I want to go back to the operations side for a moment, Abby. One of the ideas that is, gets a lot of attention, but I'm not an ops person, so I don't really know if this is something that's as prevalent in reality as it is sort of in the, Twitter sphere and Reddit and so forth. But of course, there's this idea of chaos engineering, because big, complicated systems are really hard to predict. It's very hard to know how they're going to work, especially when in cases of failure, because programmers tend to be not great about thinking about, failure paths when they're doing their development. What are your thoughts on chaos engineering as a technique for discovering blind spots?
I think it's nearly unparalleled as a technique for doing it, right? Because, and I often will try and pull test engineers towards the chaos engineering space and vice versa, because I feel like we have these two communities that are both driving towards exploratory techniques to try and run experiments and learn from them, and then react to those experiments and build more complex, more interesting experiments off the bat. And yet we're doing this in parallel, and we're not leveraging each other's techniques and each other's skills and learnings. So no, I think chaos engineering, like, for another buzzword, testing in production, can often get a bad rep because it's like, oh, chaos engineering, unplug the computer. But actually, chaos engineering takes an extremely focused engineering effort to be able to say, I am going to unplug this computer. But if things go poorly, and my hypothesis by unplugging this computer is that all of the work that was being done on that computer will get moved and there'll be no impact to our users. Now, if I'm wrong, here's how I'm going to make sure that the impact is as little as possible. So you have to do all of this thinking up front about what you think might happen. What would you do if bad things do happen when you're testing? And this is, it's extremely useful as a technique. And yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you had mentioned that there's a lot to learn from the testing and operations communities, and I hope we start seeing more collaboration there. I think there's a tendency on the part of the people who are really into like the nuts and bolts of the engineering, like you see in some operations community, to dismiss testing as being not important. But of course, the testing community has had this idea of exploratory testing for years and years and years. And Jenna, I was wondering if you would tell us about exploratory testing and how you think it fits into all of this.
Yeah. So exploratory testing for me is, so if we think about, and I'm going to call it scripted testing for lack of a better word. And I think scripted testing, anything that you know and you want to test for, should be automated. We know what we want. Exploratory testing is really about looking at what don't we know. So creating a mission or a charter. I like to use Elizabeth Hendrickson's explore with to discover format, because what am I looking for? What am I hoping to discover? And that's kind of the hypothesis that Abby was just talking about. so we have a mission, call it a mission, a charter. But we're looking for specific things, not following a script. What don't we think about? What are those unknowns? And I think that without that piece, we lose a whole lot of things. And that can be taken in a lot of different places. Programmers can be doing it on their own code while they're coding. It can be done on a story level. It could be done on a feature level. It can be done on a system level, all different places. And Abby's given some really good examples of doing it. Watching by observability, that's an exploratory kind of thing as well. So I think it's really important, and not enough emphasis is actually put on it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's not the only thing, right? But it's needed.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've talked about a whole bunch of different techniques here. We've talked about asking questions. We've talked about exploring through observability and feedback from the system.
Mm-hmm.
Talked about looking at requirements, exploratory testing, chaos engineering. Is this something that you want a testing department to do for you? Who's doing this, and how is it different than sort of the traditional, when people think, oh, this is a testing problem, how is this different than that sort of traditional thinking about testing?
So I think when people think testers, they think somebody sitting down and making sure the requirements are met. And so I'm going to take a quote from Elizabeth Hendrickson again. Testing is an activity that happens throughout. It is not necessarily a tester's job. There are some things that testers do really well because they think critically, they ask those hard questions. But testing has to be done by everybody. One of the things that I've been working with is the idea of a holistic testing loop. And when you look at the testing activities, it's everybody from the product owner right through the programmers. Are they asking the right questions? Are they thinking about how they're going to implement it? But also asking the questions they need to early. So I think testing is an activity that happens throughout the life cycle, and testers are particularly good at asking those questions all the way through. So testing it's part of a tester's job, but it's not the only part of their job. Just like a programmer programs, but it's not the only part of their job.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I think if you have a team of testers that are all the same kind of background of education and upbringing and culture, you're going to end up with, I don't know, IoT that doesn't work for darker skin tones, possibly, or other things that we have maybe seen happen around the world. So I think that, exactly what you're saying, Janet, like having that diversity across the spectrum of the organization by role will also inherently increase the diversity of the humans involved. But their role is a part of their diversity profile, but not their entire profile. Mm-hmm. I was thinking about this when you were talking, and I don't think it's very different. I do think it's a large part of what testing is as an activity done by everybody in the organization. But if I was to think of one kind of difference maybe that I would highlight, is it emphasizes the nuanced skills that come from testing. So as you were saying, Janet, like testing in some people's minds is sitting in a corner and clicking a mouse, to a script, right? And it still is that in some organizations and for some people, but it's not the main part of testing today. And what testing today is about is identifying issues and then being able to talk about the pragmatic decisions of, should we fix this? Should we not? What is the impact of this decision? How do we build to your point, James, how do we build our learning about this class of issue into our future building and our future testing and all those things? And those, I would say, more nuanced, more advanced skills associated with testing are just put in the spotlight when you talk about blind spot identification as a part of it, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Really good point.
I have, the great testers that I've met do have a different way of looking at the world, sort of what I would call the testing mindset. So what would you, if you were wanting to develop that testing mindset, not necessarily get into a testing career, but just maybe you're in an organization that doesn't have that tends to run into blind spots. And I do want to make, just for everybody listening, I want to make a really strong distinction between testing to find bugs and testing to find gaps. Because testing to find gaps is about learning what you don't know so that you can change the way you approach your work. And I think that's really valuable, even if you you don't have a lot of bugs in production. That doesn't mean that there isn't stuff that can't bite you at some point down the road. So I think having this sort of mindset of, looking at things with that sort of tester's eye can be really valuable no matter what role you're in. And let me just direct this at you to start with, Janet. What would you recommend if somebody wanted to sort of develop that sense that the great testers have? I know that's a tough question.
Yeah, it is. No, it's okay. It's okay. Because, and I've heard that testers have a different mindset. I've heard that before, but I think it can be developed. Some people do it naturally. I've had many conversations with testers around the world, and sometimes it's your life. So my husband did a little talk at a conference last year about what it's like being married to a tester. And
that's fantastic.
And it's because you can't help it. You test everything. You question everything. Why is that happening? What is that? That doesn't look right. And it's just starting to look at things in that sense, asking kind of the question. And I think that's hard to do. But if you're around people that are doing it, you start to do it. My husband does it now, for example. Where he never used to, and he'd make mistakes and have to redo something. He'd go, yeah, test first, right? He has started to think differently. And let's just test that hypothesis instead of just doing it all the time or making a little experiment. And it's just learning to ask those questions. So if you're around people like that, instead of getting annoyed at them, start to think about, why are they asking those questions? What am I missing?
It is tempting to shoot the messenger, isn't it?
Oh, it is.
Oh, yeah. Well, you shouldn't do that. It works fine if you don't do that.
Yeah.
No one will ever do that.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, somebody just did. Yeah.
Exactly.
As a programmer, so my background as a programmer, one thing that, and this isn't really about blind spot discovery, but one thing that test-driven development has taught me to do is really think through all the edge cases. Mm-hmm. And I get such a feeling of pride in my work when I take the first 20 minutes to build something, and then I spend the next 2 hours taking care of all the other things. And it really is about not just how does this work, but how can this go wrong? How can this be misunderstood? Mm-hmm. How can it be misused? Or if somebody comes into this and doesn't read all my carefully curated documentation, what might they try, and how can I guide them to the right answer?
Yeah.
If you were to say a couple of concrete things, so to your point, Janet, if people will stop being annoyed at us for always asking the questions, they'll learn a lot. But I think that there's a couple of things that I've seen, concrete skills that testers exercise and try to improve, that I think I've seen make a big difference when I work with people who don't come from that background, but can, as you say, quickly gain those skills. One big one that I've noticed that doesn't get talked a lot about is note-taking. So this whole thinking through things, you can only get so far, but kind of grabbing your notes down and then revising through them and seeing where the gaps are, I think can really stretch everybody to find that one more scenario than when they were just in their own heads having to kind of keep everything up there. There's only so much you can hold. And then the other one was the one you mentioned, Janet, around being specific with examples. I think try to think of at least, 2 more examples of how this might get used or whatever. I think that's the type of activity that everybody can do, and it's just exercising the muscles more. It will make a big difference.
Yeah, there's a comment on the chat that I feel good testers follow every rabbit hole until they get the answers they're after. And that's true, but it gets very annoying for everybody else. So if I, and more to your point you just mentioned, Abby, if I see that they're not getting it, I'm going to get up on a whiteboard, or I often just draw a picture on a piece of paper, and they'll say, is this what you mean? Right? An example. And that people will go, no, that's not what I meant. And that will bring the conversation to a close way better than me asking a million more questions.
Yeah. I love examples as a tool for sort of shaking out, because people do tend to talk abstractly when they talk about, I think this should be true, right? This is the way I'm thinking about it. But when you make it concrete and say, well, let's talk about specifics, it can change the conversation.
Absolutely.
We had one of their book club sessions. There's a practice in the book called Customer Examples, and one of our book club sessions was about that. So you can check out the archive. Those of you listening can check out the archive. It's jamesshore.com/s/AOAD2 book club. And I believe the title of that episode was Customer Examples. But if I'm wrong, I'll put it in the video. You had mentioned note taking, and one of the things that I just love as somebody who doesn't have that testing background is in Elizabeth Hendrickson's books and in the exploratory testing community, there's this list of heuristics and just stuff to check.
Yes.
And related area, just on Hacker News recently, there was this article that came across. I think it was called the Penetration Tester's Promiscuous Handbook. And it was just basically a huge collection of notes of things to try that was written by a penetration tester, which of course is for security testing.
Yeah.
I was wondering, Abby, are those sorts of checklists and heuristics common in the operations world as well?
I think that's one of those areas where I wish that there was more crossover. I don't think it's as common in that area. At least I haven't seen it as much as in the testing world. And I think it would benefit. But I would say that in the SRE space, so site reliability engineering, which is a part of the operations world that's particularly focused on scalability, reliability, and those kinds of, kind of production scenarios, I would say there is a lot of discussion over things. So you'll have conversations about, what happens if you lose connection with any of your dependencies? And these would be the start of a list of heuristics to look at. But I don't think, someone please correct me that watches this. If there is a list of those heuristics for the SRE world, I'd love to see it. But I've more just picked those up, and there's a lot more just in kind of background, in knowledge that people gain as they work in it, rather than something that is shared more widely like Elizabeth's list.
Yeah, it sounds like a great opportunity. I have a hobby of reading postmortems and incident reports, and if I could sort of distill the one thing I'm learning from those is that your configuration better be tested, because that's gonna break your system. It seems to always be, we made a configuration change and BGP went out, and then we couldn't get into our systems.
BGP is the new DNS, like the more specific DNS, So, yeah.
Again, I'd love to hear those of you watching. Love to hear your thoughts, your questions for our guests. Just raise your hand in Zoom. Love to hear from you. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks, James, and hi, Abby and Janet. So, it interests me, these blind spots, and something that's been scratching in my head while we've been talking is there's blind spots in what we're making, why we're making it. We've talked about that business purpose. At our company, like our purpose is to enjoy creating. So we focus quite a lot on the how we're making it. And, on our side, we use a ports and adapters pun to say, what are your ports and adapters into the product, the organization, the collective, your individual growth, the infrastructure, and your code base. And then we ask people to assess how their needs are being satisfied. Now, what's interesting to me right now is to wonder, is anybody doing testing on that, like automated testing, or are there ways of exploratory testing those dimensions of our team and how we support that? Is it happening? That's super fascinating to me.
I think it's absolutely an interesting question. Yeah, I definitely don't have a definite answer for you. I wish that I could say yes, and this is how you do it. It's such a good outcome. But just to maybe poke a few areas that I've heard about that might start to touch on this is, I think there's a lot of conversation around toil being the type of work that isn't particularly moving the company forward, but is required to keep the lights on, might be another term you might have used for that. And toil became particularly popular as a term from the site reliability engineering book that was written by Google about 5 years ago or so. And I would say there are definitely attempts to try and track toil because it tends to be something that's a bit soul sucking and can really take away from people's experiences on teams. The only other one I was thinking about would be all of the work that's been done to track the state of DevOps report work that was released. So Accelerate is the book that goes into the depth of how they generated those state of DevOps reports that put metrics around the success of teams. And I think there's a lot of great tools out there. I know Google has one that's open source for Google Cloud Platform where it can calculate those metrics around mean time to recovery and things along those lines. And there can be arguments about the effectiveness of those statistics, but I think that those are trying to get at what you're talking about. But I think right now it's all still a bit fuzzy from my experience with that.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for your question and comments, David. I'd like to invite Neil to share his thoughts. Neil, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Great to hear everything so far. One thing I was interested in was the book mentions penetration testing as something that usually needs outside expertise and get a firm, but be careful because some aren't that good. Is that what you've generally seen everywhere? And do you think that's the right route? Because I thought it's hard to do, but humans can learn things. Is there ever a case for building that capability in-house?
That's a great question. I'd actually love to hear what our guests think about that.
So I'm going to start this, and I'll know that you will continue it, Abby, is one of the things when we think about security testing and penetration testing as a very specific thing is if we don't teach our developers how to prevent that, we're never going to get better. Same with our testers who are working with them. How are we going to get some really basic testing aspects in? And I think that's part of that early learning. How are we going to think about it? The penetration testing and some organizations are going to be way more vulnerable. So we'll want to hire an outside person who actually has a huge set of tools. But I think if we bring a lot of that information into our teams and work with it early, then we're not going to find near as much stuff later on. And then again, that validated learning loop. If you have a security group at doing some of that, what can you learn? What can you bring back into your team?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I do want to clarify that the book's not saying that you shouldn't have those security ideas in the team, but it was talking more about how do you help discover what you need to learn rather than saying, well, just do the penetration test and then do it again later.
That can be part of how you pick your vendor, right? You can speak to a vendor who's going to actually feed back rather than just a report pass fail, feed back and then work with you possibly to introduce a training program. But yeah, I think just penetration testing for me has always been something that I have felt inadequate for. So it's not that I couldn't learn it. It's that, to be honest, I didn't have a huge interest in learning it. And I knew how very important it was to not get wrong. And so I've always basically just said, if there are other people on my team, I'd be happy to invest for them to learn, but that's something that I'm happy to bring in as an expertise. So
there's so many different areas of testing that you could become an expert at that, you can't.
Absolutely.
Security has always been an area of fascination for me. So, and it does seem like there's quite a bit of low-hanging fruit, just simple things like, prepared queries is one of our biggest vulnerabilities still. I'm actually going to, thanks very much for your comments, Neil. I'm going to switch gears because you talked earlier, Janet, about asking questions and sort of looking at the requirements. Having the ability to make a difference in this area, and even just to open people's eyes to the idea that there might be blind spots at all. A lot of making a difference around blind spots really often tends to involve making a difference in the organization outside of just the team. And I was wondering what your thoughts were about how to open people's eyes to the idea that there might be risks that they're not considering, that there might be requirements gaps, there might be blind spots that they haven't considered. What are your thoughts on that?
So things like risk storming is a really good way to think about risks. But about a month ago, I was working with an organization. So I'll tell you a story. And they were ready to start a new feature. And one of the things that they had was they had gotten into features and then had to stop because they learned more about it. So one of the things that I said, well, this would be a perfect opportunity now. Let's do a mind map with the whole team and bring in, the product owners and maybe some domain experts. You already have a list of stories and you think you're ready to start going, but let's just back up a little bit. And we did a mind map. We worked for, I think, 20 minutes on this mind map remotely using Miro. And within those 20 minutes, what it was determined just by the questions that people started asking because they could see, it was visual. It became very clear, very fast. They were not anywhere close to being ready to start this feature. There were way too many unanswered questions. The gaps were huge, but they didn't even realize it because one person had been thinking about this feature and thought they knew it all. I don't think that person was too happy with me, but it saved them a load of work later on. So sometimes something simple like a mind map can make all the difference in the world.
Speaking of them not being happy with you, one of the advantages that you and I have as consultants coming in from the outside world is we don't have to worry about whether they like us in 6 months, because
that's true.
Our job is to help people see things that they hadn't otherwise thought about and then go away so they can blame us, and sort of like the sacrificial goat, right?
Exactly.
Put all the sins on the goat, kill the goat.
That's one of my favorite questions. What's the worst that can happen? They don't hire me back.
Abby, what are your thoughts about influencing change in the organization? You said that you moved from testing to operations specifically so you could have more influence. You talked a little bit about how that's worked out for you. What are your other thoughts about, influencing people to look at these sometimes uncomfortable questions of gaps in their systems?
Yeah, I also have a background in consulting, though not currently. I've been in-house for the last 5 or 6 years, but I actually think starting my software development, software delivery experience in consulting has done me so well because I've realized that actually everyone's consulting at all times, and it's not a swear word. Consulting just means that you actually listen to what people's problems are and that you try and help them solve those problems, like help them solve their own problems by highlighting things that maybe they hadn't seen yet or that they hadn't put together, but they have all the skills usually in place to be able to do that. And so I think it's really about breaking down those illusions. So a large part of it is about just exposing people at the rate they can afford or receive to how maybe their ideas have flaws, possibly. Maybe we should talk about it. And one of my favorite places to find this is in how we track success. So there's a particular one around metrics that basically it blew my mind. And now I'm going around. I don't know if you've ever seen the XKCD about there's 10,000 people that learn something every day. And if you run into one of them, be happy you get to expose them to it. And when I learned the inaccuracies of how we track a lot of metrics with the 99th percentile and what that really means and how that's calculated, it just absolutely blew my mind that we put so much weight in this metric that actually didn't do what we thought it did. Right. And so it's one of my favorite things to go around and say, okay, so we're measuring success in this way. What does that actually look like? How do we actually calculate the number that's measuring that success? And when we start to dive down, what it turns into frequently is it was the easy thing to measure, not the right thing to measure. And that's one place that I often find those illusions to break that can then start to give people energy to build that back up in a better way. Because often they weren't the ones who wrote the metrics. So they can easily point and go, yeah, you're right. That's terrible. I'm like, great. Now let's make it better. How do we do that? And now they can have some ownership over the thing that they're reporting on every week or, whatever the pattern is.
that searching under the streetlight phenomenon, it comes from the joke, lost my keys. I'm looking here. Why? Not because that's where I left my keys, but that's because where the light is good. It's really, really common. It's
hard not to.
Yeah, it's hard not to. And yeah, we're measuring this thing because it's easy, not because it's good. But people can really hold on to that. Now, we've got just a couple minutes. So is that enough time for you to share this sort of mind-blowing idea about the 99th percentile?
I think so. So basically, the way metrics work in most systems, though you check your own systems before you take this and yell at people about it, is that they aggregate numbers and they get collected in basically buckets. So basically, it's frequent that it's about every 15 seconds, they count how many requests took between 0 and 0.5 seconds, and how many for latency, for how long the request took to respond, and how many requests took between 0.5 seconds and 1 second. And the way those buckets are often distributed is they're quite small at the beginning. It's like between 0 and 0.1 second or something. And then as they get longer, higher, they start to get bigger. So you might have a bucket that's between, 10 seconds and 20 seconds. How many requests came in that took that long? Well, when you're getting thousands of requests, even hundreds of requests that drop into each of those buckets, the 95th percentile is going to drop somewhere in that bucket. And there's basically math being done behind the scenes that says, yeah, it's probably somewhere around here in the bucket. And it gives you a very precise number that your 99th percentile is, 7.34 seconds, when actually it's dropped into this bucket that's between 5 and 15 seconds. And you don't know what that actually means and how that goes. So those aggregate numbers, depending on how you collect them, depending on how you read them, can be far less accurate than they maybe look, given the fact they give 2 decimal places and seem quite precise.
Fantastic. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have today. I thank Abby, Janet, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
This has been great. Thank you so much.
It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. Abby Bangser is a principal engineer at Syntasso, and Janet Gregory is co-founder of the Agile Testing Fellowship. Next week is Agile 2022. So I'm going to be in Nashville enjoying the conference. And if you plan on being there, look me up. You can tweet me at James Shore, and I would love to get together to chat about just about anything. But I won't be hosting a book club next week because I'm going to be at the conference. So our next session is going to be on July 29th. And we've got Diana Larson and Linda Rising who are going to be joining us to discuss team dynamics. This is an important topic and 2 of my favorite people. So it is going to be a great discussion. Be sure to mark your calendar for July 29th at 8 a.m. Pacific. Free reading is up at jamesshore.com/s/AOAD2 book club. And you can join the Discord conversation by visiting jamesshore.com/s/AOAD2 Discord. That is it for today. Thank you once again, Janet, Abby, everybody who participated, everybody who watched. Really appreciate you joining us today. And I will see you on the 29th.